Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Gesso. Our guest is Major Mike Hilliard, who was formerly of the Baltimore City Police Department in the United States and is now a representative, a spokesperson for a group called the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, formerly known as the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, but since sort of rebranded themselves to include more than just ending the drug war and including basically social and community services that sort of stop crime at the root of crime, which they see as to be, poverty and disparity. What was interesting for me in this interview is that I have never spoken to a police officer in this context before. I preface the interview, as you'll see, with some transparency around how I feel about police officers, which is that although conceptually I understand that an individual represents themselves, but an individual wearing a uniform and a badge also represents the larger institution of which they are a part of, and of course then represents, for me, every other person I have interacted with who is representing that institution wearing a uniform and a badge. And unfortunately, despite my higher cognitive reasoning, I tend to respond immediately. My nervous system immediately responds with predator rather than protector due to some unfortunate interactions that I've had with police in the past, which, as I mentioned, is a two-way street for sure. But it was there, and that was the underpinning of the conversation as I asked him about what it was like for him, why he became a police officer, what it was like for him as a police officer, working in the drug crime division, and what eventually led him to becoming a public representative to end the war on drugs. Some other interesting questions I really wanted to hear from him, hear his perspective on, was about police corruption and misuse of power and, what do you do when the orders come in and ask for unethical behavior? This isn't something I've never had the opportunity to ask a police officer for their perspective on, and I felt really good about the interaction. And my end conclusions aren't for me to tell you here. I'm going to let you enjoy the interview and draw your own conclusions. I really valued this one, and I'm happy to share it with you. This podcast is brought to you by listeners like yourself via Patreon and via direct donations over PayPal, some email money transfers if you live in Canada, or by some variety of cryptocurrencies. In regards to Patreon, there are some people who have been giving very generously, and their names, if you're watching this on YouTube, are represented up in the corner, or they are written in the description to this episode. So a really big thank you to those people and to those of you who have been giving generously in donations and have been a part of my Patreon and have been participating in the community and enjoying the rewards that come with being a part of that community. So thank you very much. If you are listening and you would like to contribute to this work that I am doing and help me earn a full-time income doing so, you can head to patreon.com/James W. Gesso to check me out on Patreon, or you can head to jameswgesso.com/support in order to check out the variety of different ways that you can help nourish the show here financially and otherwise. Links to that will be in the description to this video. That's it for now. Thank you very much for listening to this intro. Here is my interview with retired police major Mike Hilliard, formerly of the Baltimore Police Department, currently representing the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Enjoy. Michael Hilliard began his 27-year policing career in 1975 as a patrolman in an economically depressed neighborhood in East Baltimore. He served as an internal affairs detective where he coordinated Baltimore youth programs and led an undercover squad that investigated violent crimes and low to mid-level drug crimes. As a lieutenant assigned to the Northeast District. He helped establish the largest citizens patrol in the Mid-Atlantic area, the Northeast Citizens Patrol. Hilliard also served 6 chiefs of parole as an executive officer. In his final position before retirement, he directed 911 operations and police dispatch as a major in the communications division. After retirement, Hilliard became Community Services Director at Harble, a nonprofit community. Major Hilliard, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So,
my honor to be with you. Go ahead.
To be honest, I have never spoken to a police officer in this context before. Unfortunately, the majority of my interactions with police over the years have been poor. And of course, that is a two-way street. I have, unfortunately, however, often been mistreated by an abuse of power multiple times. And furthermore, the media around policing in the last few years has really taken a turn towards exposition of such abuse of power. Now, I know that this type of behavior is not universal. However, these factors have really colored my perception of policing, wherein my immediate internal reaction when I see a police officer is unfortunately predator and not protector. And I tell you this in respect to transparency and honesty, but also because I'm very interested in having those perceptions challenged and expanded throughout the course of this interview. And you knowing where I'm coming from might help you to understand the mindset behind my questions. So to start off, maybe give us a sense of who you are as a person of aspiration, care, and purpose in this world, and tell us the story of how and why you became a police officer and what it was you hoped to achieve.
Well, both my parents are school teachers. My dad was probably, as I matured, not only my primary mentor, but also my best friend. So one day when I was probably in my late teens or 20s, I sat down with him. And what I wanted to do is have a conversation with him where he told me what to do with the rest of my life. And he told me 3 things instead. He said, do something you enjoy, do something that helps people, and do something you can support a family with. So I came out of college. Candidly, when I was in college, my thought was I was going to study primarily religion, sociology, and psychology and go into seminary and become an Episcopal priest. I didn't feel called. So I was looking for a profession where I could serve people. And the Baltimore Police Department was hiring. I had kind of always been interested in law enforcement. So that's why I went into it. And, I mean, I hear what you said, and I understand your perspective, but I think if you really go back and talk to most police officers, they will tell you that the reason they entered into law enforcement as a career is because they found it a unique opportunity for them to serve the public. And they entered in a spirit of public service, not to be a predator, not to dominate people, but because this was their way of serving the public and earning a living at the same time. So, and most of the officers I worked with and the personnel do it. You know, the term law enforcement when referring to police is kind of a misnomer, because what I found is 90% of what I did had nothing to do with law enforcement. It had to do with diffusing personal situations that had gone bad. And so, you know, that's my story.
Definitely, in reflecting on you know this interview and preparing for it, I wondered about why I had that perspective. And of course, my past experiences, and then those past experiences being given meaning and interpretation by, you know, whatever content I engage, media content, and the unfortunately large amount of media content I have seen that sort of exemplifies the abuse of power, but sort of underrepresents the paradigm and the intentions of going into a policing career that you've mentioned is a part of that. But another part of it is because I know that I am a person who uses drugs as a part of my lifestyle, and I like to think that I use them responsibly. And I also am a public advocate for responsible use, for the removal of prohibition and new drug policies being put forth. And I think to some degree, I fear that despite the larger framework of responsibility and care and causing no harm, that I would still be seen simply as a drug user and have the laws against drugs, which I think are thoroughly poor, enforced against me. And that I think that probably shows up as a part of it. And that goes specifically into why I have you on the show, because you're here as a representative of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, or LEAP, which holds the vision of ending the drug war. Maybe you can explain in further detail what LEAP is and how you went from leading operations with drug crime to being a public advocate for drug policy reform?
Well, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership is an organization composed of active and current law enforcement professionals, prosecutors, judges, correctional officers who believe, like you do, that prohibition is not working, and that that believe that the narcotics should be legalized, regulated, and controlled. And what we believe is the war on drugs has failed, prohibition has failed, and we need to change drug policy in this country. As to how I came to LEAP, back in the 1980s, Kurt Schmoke was mayor of Baltimore City, and he got then on a brand new program called Nightline on ABC. And he talked about we needed to have a national conversation about how we deal with narcotics, particularly illegal narcotics in our society. And I was a sergeant on the Baltimore Police Department at that time. And candidly, I thought he lost his mind, because I believed illegal drugs were bad. I believed the people who sold illegal drugs were bad. And my intent was to go after people who did that. So then later on, and you mentioned it, I was an executive officer of the Chief of Patrol, and what I started to notice was when the department, jointly with federal and state agencies, took off the top level of the drug organization, what we would experience in that area would be an increase in violence. And the increase in violence would be due to drug dealers fighting over turf. So I kind of started thinking about the illegal drug business and what it really is. And I believe the illegal drug business is capitalism at its purest. It's high profit, low overhead, high risk. And if you accept that assumption, the law of supply and demand applies to that business. And what we know is that if there is a demand, there shall be a supplier. So in the war against drugs, the way we have attacked what we perceive as a drug problem is literally to go after the supplier. Well, if it truly is capitalism at its purest, and you consistently keep removing the supplier, the only thing that will happen is somebody else will step up to meet the demand. So I believe we need to legalize, regulate, and control narcotics, and the money we gain from that by taking that money away from the illegal drug business and potentially putting it in government, we should commit to treatment and start seriously addressing the demand. I mean, what I hear from the current administration and often from Maryland state government here is this constant, the way we're going to address the opioid crisis is to go after the dealers. And again, if going back to the premise, if you assume it's capitalism at its purest, all you're doing again is removing the supplier, and you haven't addressed any of the demand. And I don't hear a lot of putting more money into treatment in prevention programs, which in other countries have really worked. When you, particularly in Portugal, in Switzerland, when they started to decriminalize or legalize drugs, and they put significant money into education and treatment, and even in some cases care and maintenance, what they found was the number of youth involved in drugs decreased. You had less people using drugs. Drug use overall decreased, and your issues that evolved around the illegal drug trade, the violence, all the stuff that goes with that just went away. So we've really lost the battle. Well, I mean, we've lost the war, and we got to quit fighting it. The other thing that really brought me to this was when I started thinking about this. I started thinking about when I was a young police officer in the 70s in the Eastern District, working a fairly challenged African-American neighborhood. And I'm a white guy. My dad taught at a private preparatory school. I went there for free. I went to college in West Virginia. I came back. I went to the police academy in a nice area of Baltimore called Mount Washington, and then they assigned me to the Eastern District. And so you can see I was really well prepared to be a street cop in a challenged African-American neighborhood.
Right, yeah.
So an African-American officer named Marty Ward, he was kind of everything I'm not. He was tall, dark, and handsome. Marty was the kind of guy, when you were single, you wanted to go to the bar with him because you'd just be happy if you went on with his cast-offs, and really charismatic man and a superb street cop. Took me under his wing. And Marty had one weakness that was my strength. Marty was not administratively sound. Marty had difficulty taking what happened and writing a narrative on paper that people could chronologically follow and understand. So Marty and I would work cases together, and basically I would do the paperwork. And I learned to be a street cop that way. So I got promoted to sergeant, went on to supervise a plainclothes squad in the Northern District. Marty went on to join a federal state Baltimore police task force dealing with drugs. He was upstairs in a row house in southwest Baltimore one night doing a controlled buy with a fairly high-level drug dealer in the area. There was a raid team down below that was ready to go in. Marty was wearing a wire. The drug dealer got hinky, and he killed Marty. And that night, I lost a friend and a mentor. But later on, what I realized is I'd lost that friend and mentor to the war on drugs. So anyway, progressively, I kind of personally, internally questioned what we were doing as a law enforcement officer. And when I retired, I actually got to the point that if you'd approached me and said, I think we ought to legalize, regulate, and control drugs, you probably I probably would have looked at you and say, I'm not going to argue with you. And then in my current job, we held a public safety summit called the North Baltimore Public Safety Summit. Kurt Schmoke spoke, and Neil Franklin, who's the executive director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, spoke. And I'm sitting listening to Neil Franklin thinking, you know what, this is crazy. I got to join this organization. So I pulled out my cell phone and joined it online right then and there. And then later on became a lead speaker for the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. So that's kind of how my position on the war on drugs evolved. But, I mean, it's fairly easy to understand the current police mentality. If you say illegal drugs are bad, and candidly, I think they are, because they're totally uncontrolled. You don't know the product you're getting. There's no regulation of them, and the people that sell them are bad. And if you look at the opioid crisis right now with the consistent lacing of heroin with fentanyl and carfentanil without the user knowing it, they aren't nice people. Then the way you approach it is, well, drugs are bad, the people that sell drugs are bad, so we're going to lock them up. And so that's kind of the mentality some people in law enforcement have.
Mm-hmm. But this is in many ways a bit of a broken mentality, as you were saying before, because
absolutely, it's not working at all. But that's, I mean, if you're having a discussion about, well, how do these people get to this conclusion so that they do what they do, that's all I'm saying. But no, it's absolutely broken. And it absolutely does not work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, going back far enough, you see, or anyone who's looking can see that the war on drugs very likely started with Nixon utilizing drugs as a bit of a red herring to suppress anti-Vietnam activists and the uprising of people of color into political power inside of their communities. And even further back, the very sort of founder of cannabis prohibition, Harry J. Anslinger, was, as far as history can see, a stark racist and strongly behind the criminalizing of drug use, making people who have severe substance dependence seen as criminals rather than as sick people, and treated as criminals rather than treated as sick people.
Yeah, that I always find that an interesting presumption that, not presumption, but a way to deal with things on the part of those people is because when you look at drug use, it's no more prevalent in the African American community than it is in other communities, other races within the nation. So it perplexes me why they took that approach, but you're right. I mean, we hit up to the 20s. What was in Coca-Cola?
Yeah, right.
And up to and then you had Engler come in and marijuana is bad, opioids are bad. We got to make them illegal, and then it rolled from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the very history of the war on drugs was based in fallacy, and it was never going to work, and it's pretty clear now. We have the data that supports very clearly that it's not working. Multiple times now you've mentioned the opioid crisis, or what is often called the opioid epidemic. And although you've already spoken on it a little bit, maybe you could clarify what you see the role of the current model of prohibition playing inside of this crisis.
I don't see it playing anything. I mean, I don't see it resolving it or assisting it. Because once again, you know, you have... I mean, if you want to address the consumption, then what you need to do is literally provide treatment on demand. Mm-hmm. And that treatment has to be of high quality, and it's going to be expensive. And we're not doing that. I mean, that again, that's, you know, if you have a problem, the problem goes down to the demand. You know, and even I remember reading something about conversations between U.S. government and Mexican government officials, and one of the things Mexico kind of said very gently to the American diplomats was, you know, if your people weren't so driven to buy this stuff, we might not have the problem at the level we have it. And we never really addressed that. And so if there's a demand, there's going to be a supplier. And you're back to that again. So I don't see how the current philosophy and approach addresses the opioid crisis at all. I mean, we've got to look at treatment. We have to look at safe consumption centers. You know, and maybe if somebody's been through treatment 3 or 4 times, we may have to consider heroin maintenance. But, you know, and we've got to get the product off the street and into a controlled, regulated environment so we don't have people sitting in a dark room firing up with stuff they believe is heroin and laced with something else. Mm-hmm. You know,
yeah, I'm
then
definitely
dying.
On board with you there. Yeah.
And then dying. You know, I mean, there's safe consumption centers in Vancouver, Canada, and mm-hmm. one of the things they did was a study of the street drugs that were brought in for safe consumption, and they found that I think 80% of the heroin was laced with fentanyl, and the user didn't know it. I mean, it wasn't like they intentionally went out and bought a product that they knew was laced with fentanyl. They thought they were getting heroin, and so you know, until you start legalizing, regulating, controlling it, you're going to have bad actors involved in it who don't care about what the product is on the street, and they'll sell just about anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like I said, I'm very much on board with you there. The would inform my question there about the current model of prohibition and the role that it was playing is looking at the enforcement of prohibition. So if all these things are straight up illegal, and by the fact that they are illegal, they're bad, which means the people who sell them are bad, then we go after the people who are selling them, and we end up taking out the supply. Now, I think back recently where here in Ontario, Canada, which is where I'm located, the police made a major cocaine bust where they had like some like obscene amount of pure cocaine that they busted. And there's this picture of these 2 officers holding this massive, like what looks like a boulder of pure cocaine. And it was this very prideful presentation of the accomplishment of all the investment of this police work. And all I could see was, Well, for every gram of cocaine, pure cocaine that they remove from the street, is another gram of filler that just got put into the supply, which includes fentanyl, and only worsens the problem. And that's where I was coming from, was this perception of our current prohibition actually just not only just losing the war on drugs, but making it worse every day.
Yeah, it does. I mean, in the U.S., we tried to prohibit a drug before in the 1920s and 30s, and up till 1939, and it or 1930s, and it didn't work too well. And you had a lot of bad actors getting involved in the distribution of it, and you had a lot of bad product going out there, and you had people dying from it, and that was alcohol. So we've already had experience with prohibiting a drug. It didn't work. Why are we doing it again?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that is an extremely reasonable question. It's an extremely reasonable question. So moving on a little bit, and again, a bit of a warning, I sometimes tend to ask compound questions. So in general, but in specific to the issue of drug policy and extrally specific to that of the opioid crisis, what do you see as the role of policing, and where do you see it failing to achieve that role, and what do you see as possible shifts in approach that might help?
Well, if you legalize and regulate and control narcotics, then you no longer need to dedicate the law enforcement resources that are dedicated to the enforcement of those laws and going after illegal narcotics on the street. So police work then shifts to really what it's truly, if you go back to the Peel's founding of the London Metropolitan Police Department, which, by and large is to keep the peace. I mean, that's the police's role. And so then you can start concentrating on those crimes that seriously affect people's quality of life, robbery, theft, burglary. And you could put more resources into that. The other thing that may happen is if, police commissioner in Baltimore, Thomas Fraser, once said that 75% of the crime in Baltimore, Maryland, which is where I am and where I've lived all my life, is due to the illegal drug trade. I mean, it revolves around it. It's either drug dealers. These. If you and I if I'm infringing on your turf, we don't go to a lawyer or a mediator to resolve the issue. I mean, we start shooting at one another. So, or people who are addicted to drugs, attempting to maintain their habit. So that's where he said 75% of the crime in Baltimore revolves around that. If you legalize drugs, and they would probably become higher quality and more affordable, then you reduce a lot of crime. And if that actually happens over a period of time, you may be able to take money out of funding law enforcement and start putting it into programs that'll really affect crime. And here's where I'm coming from. We look at crime. Crime is not a disease; it's a symptom of the disease. And so, what we need to do to eliminate crime is to start to address the disease itself, which is poverty and poor education, inability to find a job that will support your family. So if you can start shifting some of all that money we put into law enforcement of those types of things, you can actually long-term reduce crime.
So moving on still, during your investigations where you worked plain clothes and maybe undercover, you could clarify that if I'm misunderstanding. What did you learn about the drug culture in that time, like the people using, and how did what you learned fit or contradict what you were led to believe about drug users and drug culture from your police training? And what is the perception of drug culture within the policing culture, and where do those perceptions askew from the truth?
Well, I think at the time I was doing that type of work, my thought process was that these people had made a bad choice, and as a result of their bad choice, they became addicted to a substance. My feeling on that is significantly involved, because if one of the things we do in my current organization, one of the things my current organization does is run a prevention recovery center where they treat people for alcohol and drug abuse. And one of the things that I've realized over time, and even towards the end of my law enforcement career, is typically if you look at people who are addicted to drugs, there's an underlying psychological issue that is probably due to some abuse or trauma that person sustained earlier in their life, and the way they dealt with it was to self-medicate. And when that and so one of the things they do in order to self-medicate, when they self-medicate and then become addicted, and then they've got to maintain their habit, and if they lose their job, then the way they maintain their habit is sometimes resort to crime. So that's the kind of perception I have now. I really haven't talked to a lot of police officers recently about this specific issue, but my gut would be that most of them feel that that's the way addiction evolves, the way I just described it, that there's some underlying social psychological trauma. That person chooses to self-medicate, they become addicted, and then they're stuck. And so I'm, and I don't ever remember really wanting to target the user. I mean, in my career, it was always about the supplier. That's the really bad person, so let's go get them, Now, would we arrest a user and leverage that to get a supplier? Yeah. I wasn't beyond that. But actually targeting the user, no.
So now I have another question actually that just came up as you were speaking there about the perception of drug use amongst police officers, and for, again, you could probably only speak for yourself and also from your experience, but when a police officer is encountering somebody, say, in possession of drugs, is there like this blanket, if they have drugs, then they are a drug user, and drug users all fall into the same category, regardless of the drug? Or is there some sort of nuance where it's like, this person, this person only has, like a bag of weed on them that's like, half a, 4 or 5 grams of weed, that they're probably fine, or oh, this person just has a few hits of LSD. Like, do they look at it and assess, like, by the drug, by the use, by the quantity? Do they make these sort of reasonable assessments as to this person being a danger to themselves or to the community and act from there? Or is it more common to have this sort of blanket approach of like, well, you're in possession of illegal drugs. That's bad. You're bad. Here we go. Time to get into the legal system, arrest, and so forth.
It's even more nuanced than that. So I confront you on the street. Somehow I do a legal search. And I find a bag of weed on you. It's small enough that I know it's probably for personal use. You know what my thought process is? Oh, crap. Literally. Because now I'm stuck. And this was back when I was. Now I'm stuck because I know you're in possession of contraband. I've got to enforce that law, but I really don't want to because it's not worth the amount of paperwork and time and effort I'm going to do to go through this. And you're obviously not a supplier. I mean, I don't believe you're a supplier. So but I can't, as a law enforcement officer, I can't just ignore the law or just toss the narcotics and walk away, So yeah, I mean, there's definite distinction between the user and the distributor. Now, that's gotten a little better in Maryland now, because now in Maryland, if I do the same thing with you, I write you a citation. And seize the narcotics and send you on the way. And you're still criminally charged. You got to appear in court, but you don't get, I don't put handcuffs on you, I don't hold you away, I don't take you to central booking, the whole 9 yards. So, and in Maryland, I believe they decriminalized certain quantities of marijuana. It's a civil issue and not a criminal anymore. And then in Colorado and states where it's legalized, it's totally changed. And there's a clear difference. And it's like you get somebody with small quantities of drugs, it's kind of like, I wish I could just go to the nearest dumpster and toss them, because I really don't want to have to go through the changes I'm going to have to go through to make this arrest and prosecute this case.
Right. Plus the life-altering and really negatively impactful results of somebody getting busted for something that's not a harm to themselves or their community in any way, and then they and maybe end up going to prison, or like have the rest of their life having to address themselves as a ex-convict, and all the negative impact that has, especially around something as low harm as cannabis.
Yeah, and most cops, that's not why they want to do the job. I mean, they want to arrest the person performing the armed robberies. They want to arrest the burglar. They want to arrest the person who's beating up the old lady down the street. I mean, that's kind of their vision of, how they serve the public. And, and then once they get on, they realize, well, part of their job is diffusing pretty intense emotional situations, and they get good at that. They're not into locking up somebody for small quantities of marijuana that they have for use, and I don't really think they have a really negative perception of people who do use, Now, candidly, if the person's using and they're walking up and down the street and creating a significant disturbance that they have to deal with. They're not pleased about that. But, otherwise it's just kind of like, oh, God, I can't believe I got this guy on this amount of stuff. Now what do I have to go through? And what do I have to put that person through? So,
And I assume that this would really be influenced by the sort of subculture of policing, because where you are might be different than the way that particular scenario might be engaged somewhere in the southern United States or in one of the non-legalized West Coast states. And I want to ask you about something that goes back to the beginning of the interview. Is why do you think it is, and this is a bigger question about policing in general, why do you think it is that we are seeing such a large exposition of inappropriate use of power by the way of the police? Like in your experiences, is it as ubiquitous as the media tends to make it seem? Is it sort of regional? How big of a problem is this? And what do you think that we could be doing to shift this?
Well, probably my opinion on this contradicts some positions LEAP might, Law Enforcement Action Partnership might take, or its leadership. See, here's and I developed this perception of the media as a law enforcement officer. If it leads, it bleeds. If it bleeds, it leads. If it's unique and sensational, it's news. If it's the norm, it's not. So, if you think about the number of police and civilian interactions that occur daily in this country, compared to the number of police-civilian interactions that were inappropriately handled by the police, the number of interactions that were inappropriately handled are an insignificant number. Now, that doesn't mean you condone it, because your ultimate goal is to not have any. So, honestly, I think it's overplayed. I'm not saying they don't happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I really think if you look at most departments, you have a small number of officers who are having inappropriate and unconstitutional relations with the community, and those are the people that are getting the attention by the media, and then there's a perception that all police are like that, and that's not true. I used to, when I was an internal affairs detective, Maryland has what's called the Maryland Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, and one of the things I used to say to one of the fraternal order police attorneys who represented people I was investigating was, if I can take your client's rights away, then somebody can take mine away. And when I was on the street, I felt the same way about the public. If I am able to take a right away from a civilian, then someday somebody can do that to me. So I was incredibly protective about both. And I think that's the way a lot of officers think, that my job is to come in here and to police in a constitutional and professional manner. Now, are there bad apples in policing? Absolutely. Are there bad apples in the medical profession? Yes. Are there bad apples in are there in the legal profession? Yeah. I mean, there are bad apples in every profession. So it becomes the responsibility of those professions to root out those people and get them out of it. And that's what law enforcement agencies need to do.
And I completely agree. I've heard some various media reports, excuses being made for inappropriate police behavior, which is, it's just a few bad apples. But the whole line of that metaphor is a few bad apples spoils the bunch. And so there definitely needs to be, like you said, rooting those particular officers out and removing them from the scenario and making sure that illegal behaviors embraced by the civilian population or embraced by police are treated as illegal behaviors and punished, or just addressed in the same way. Although I have heard criticisms from former police officers in different places online, talking about there being a bit of a this is going to be very gender specific just for the use of the term, but I know that it's not necessarily male only, but a bit of a boys club in the sense that it's like once you're inside, you take care of each other, almost like a fraternity or a sorority. You take care of each other. You don't rat out your partner, even if your partner is doing something illegal. And this kind of like community cover up of this type of bad behavior. Is this an issue? Like, have you seen this to be an issue? Or can you comment on that?
Well, it certainly becomes a fraternity, and you bond with one another because of what you do for a living, and that you're literally, your welfare depends upon those you work with. I mean, if your physical safety depends on the person working the car next to you. So, and law enforcement is not something you totally understand unless you did it. We had at one point we had a chief of human resources who was a civilian, and he was good. I mean, he was a great guy, and he was really trying to he was doing some really good things. But he was standing talking to me and another lieutenant one day, and he was kind of saying, "I just don't get you guys, you people," meaning those of us who were sworn with badges and guns. And this friend of mine who was a lieutenant looked at him and said, "So, if somebody fires a gun down the hall, what do you do?" Looking at the chief, and the chief says, "I run the other way." And he looked at the chief and he said, "You're doing the logical, correct, and normal thing, is you remove yourself from danger." He said, Mike and I'll move to it. So you have to assume a totally different type of culture and thought process than most people do in their lives. So that's that there is this bonding. But I will tell you, nobody hates a crooked cop more than a straight one. You may be appalled at some corruption activity that's going on in a department. You would not believe how appalled the officers are who are really trying to do their profession well in that same department. I had a conversation with Kevin Davis, who's the police commissioner of Baltimore, invited me down for a one-on-one conversation at one point because I do a lot of work in crime prevention with the police from the Northeast District, and I'm a retired major, so he for some reason wanted to talk to me, and I told him two things. I said, you need to have two things in a police agency. One, you need to have an extremely efficient and competent internal affairs division that is literally feared. And the other thing is you have to have an incredibly competent and active inspections component that identifies issues to commanders so that they can address them before they become significant problems. And if you have those two things in an agency, you significantly reduce the amount of damage the bad apples can do, and you root them out and get rid of them.
So, I can definitely see how frustrating it would be as a person who wants to represent what policing is supposed to represent, and do your job well, and be a good service to your community, and then to have somebody in your ranks who is sullying everything that you stand for. I want to go back to something that you were saying about how police often recognize, if I take this person's rights away, at some point someone can take my rights away from me. And there's an evolving social criticism that policing has ultimately become the long arm of enforcement for a political and economic agenda that no longer represents the value of community safety and the integrity of the people. Great examples of this might be some of the, extreme reactions and assaults that took place at various places during the Occupy movement, or here in Canada and Toronto back in, I think it was 2010, during the G20 summit. There were massive amounts of police officers in all black with no badges and no identifying material and riot gear that basically repeatedly assaulted peaceful protesters. Now, I don't assume that is necessarily every time the individual officer making a bad choice. These are orders that are coming them from higher up. So do you feel that this criticism of what policing has come to represent is a fair assessment? Or do you feel like it's off base? Am I missing something from the bigger picture here, as myself being an outsider to the policing culture?
So we had a sociology teacher in the academy by the name of Dr. Hochreiter. And one of the things he said is that because you wear a uniform, and because you're identifiable, and because you wear a badge, you will become the face of the government you were employed by. And if that government is acting inappropriately, then you in turn will face the consequences of that. So you're talking to a guy who literally stood with, and I wasn't dressed anywhere near what you're talking about. I mean, I was wearing a ride helmet with a shield, and I had a nightstick, monitoring a peaceful protest as eggs and tomatoes hit me. And I just stood there because that's what we were told to do. I mean, unless they come at you or they start moving in areas they're prohibited in going into, don't take aggressive action against them. So that's what we did. If I had a nickel for every time somebody told me I copulated with my mother, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. So, I mean, a good law enforcement officer will take a lot of abuse in order to diffuse a situation or in order to keep the peace. Now, if they're ordered on the other hand, they're good at doing what they're told. So if they're ordered to move on a group, they'll do it. So a lot of it has to do with who's in charge, who's making the decisions about movement, and in the cases you cited, my guess was the decision to move that crowd was probably not made by anybody in the police department. It was probably made by somebody in the Canadian government. And when they went to move it, things went bad and things got violent. So, the police become the representative, the face of government, whether government's good or bad.
Mm. So this leads to like a moral question, which I mean, perhaps you can't answer at least conclusively. Say you're in that situation again, and you're asked to move on these people, and yet you believe in what they represent, and you don't feel that that their voices should be suppressed simply because they fly in the face of the economic agenda of highly questionable people who have made it to the top of the government ladder. What do you do when your own ethics and moral values are called into question when you're asked to police in a specific way by the people above you?
And my answer, truthfully, is I don't know, because I've never been faced with it. I mean, I was never literally asked to do something that I, at the time, didn't believe was the correct action. I mean, one of the things that really kind of befuddles me is I read accounts of former Baltimore police officers about this corrupt organization, and they're doing this and they're doing that. And I look at it, and it was like, were we in the same department?
Mm.
Now, there were a couple of things about me that may have been a little unique. I mean, I was always a straight arrow, and I became an internal affairs detective. And candidly, when you go to internal affairs, it literally brands you for the rest of your career, in some way. And
right, like you can't be trusted with the potential truth because
you
might come down.
I'm not going to act out in front of him because it will not end up well for me.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily you can't be trusted. You can earn that trust. I did. I mean, I literally had an officer come up to me one day who I had literally justified his action, and it was appropriate. And he said, I bet you can write me out of anything, Sergeant. And I said, yeah, I probably can, but I can also write you into it. But, I mean, obviously he was at the point he trusted me, and what I would do in a situation. But so there was an inclination not to act out in front of me, I think. Maybe that's why I never saw it. But it was I didn't work in a corrupt organization with corrupt people. I mean, I work with people who really had a desire to do good work and serve the public. And I have trouble with this perception that, and I get where it comes from. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't predator cops out there, but, everybody in a blue suit's a predator, or everybody in the brown suit or with the badge is a predator. They're not. I mean, a lot of us were out there to do the right thing and to serve the public. And that's why we do the job. And I went back and I told you I wanted to be an Episcopal priest. And what I realized over a period of time is my mission as a person of faith was being a law enforcement officer. So if your mission is based on your faith in your service to the public, you really want to do it well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That really brings the interview full circle, and I definitely just want to acknowledge and thank you for doing your absolute best to be in a place of integrity and like strong moral standings in your role as a police officer, especially when confronted with the moments where you were unfortunately being held accountable for the shitty predatory actions of other officers and of a governmental body that may or may not be representing the people properly, and to have, as far as I've heard in this interview, handled it with integrity. So thank you for that.
It was my honor and pleasure. I loved it. I truly did. So thank you for letting me do it.
And another thank you for being on the show today, Major Hilliard. Is there any links or direction you'd like to offer the listeners today? For example, if they'd like to learn more about LEAP, or if I don't know how many police officers I have listening to my show, unless they're maybe profiling me, but for officers who might be interested in getting involved, or the civilians?
Well, I would ask them to Google Law Enforcement Action Partnership, or use whatever. Let me Google. Use their search engine of choice to search Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and take a look at the Law Enforcement Action Partnership website. Learn about what we do, and we learn about our Speakers Bureau. We have speakers throughout the United States and Canada who are willing to come to your organization to talk about the war on drugs, its failure, and how Prohibition doesn't work, and also to talk about a lot of the other issues that you brought up today about police culture and the militarization of police and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you again, Major Hilliard, for being a part of LEAP. This is it seems like we're living in a fairly insane world currently, and the war on drugs is a real encapsulation of how insane things are. So it's nice to have people and organizations such as LEAP doing their best to represent a little bit of sanity in this mess that we're all in.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Okay, take care.
You too.
And so concludes episode 64 of Adventures Through the Mind podcast, here with your host, James W. Jesso. Thank you very much for listening to this show or watching it on YouTube. If you enjoyed it and you haven't yet, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you're watching it on YouTube, make sure you turn on notifications so that you can be sure to know when new videos are being released. And of course, a thumbs up is very supportive to help other people find the show if you liked it. This podcast is brought to you by listeners like yourself via Patreon and via direct donations over PayPal, some email money transfers if you live in Canada, or by some variety of cryptocurrencies. I really couldn't be continuing to be on this journey and producing this content if it weren't for your financial and obviously this means energetic support. So thank you very, very much to the people who have been donating and to my patrons on Patreon. If you're just checking this out for the first time and you're like, gosh darn, I want to support this guy too, then you can head over to patreon.com/James W. Jesso to become my patron if you can. And if you head to jameswjesso.com/support, you can check out the variety of different ways of supporting this show financially and otherwise. So the links to that are always in the descriptions to this episode. And I thank you very much for listening, and I will see you on the next. Take care.